morning. So we'll start with making a mandala offering as a token for requesting the teachings, and then for correcting a motivation, we'll go for refuge and bodhicitta. Sa-shi po-ki ju-shi-me-to Ram-ri-rav-ling-shi Ni-de-gen-pa-di Sangye-shindu Mikte-owa Gir-joku-namda Shin-la-chu-pa-sho-idan Guru-ratna-mandala-kam-niyatayami. Chonam Zogi Chonam La Chanchu Badu Dani Kyasuchi Dagi Chushigi Betonangi Drola Penchi Sange Dopa Sho Chonam Zogi Chonam La Chanchu Badu Dani Kyasuchi Dagi Chushigi Betonangi Drola Penchi Sange Dopa Sho
Sanje Chodam Poji Chonam La Chancho Badu Dani Kyabsun Dagi Chushi Yebanza Dagi Drolam Bench Sanje Drupara Sho Kangi Tuzini Zone Dawa Tamje Pambi Chere Tambi Chun Denze Kodam Chela Chanze Lo Morning everyone.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Geshe is happy to see you. Nah.
Yeah. Ani tangazu sanimagi community shugogras zanimi community lojonimi serseti resta manchadin del pegora.
So what we are what we're looking at on Sundays, every Sunday, is mind training. So we've been studying a text that is called Mind Training Like the Rays of the Sun.
This is tadi Sanji Tende Sanji Chudun Soju Chonam Las Chanju Pardu Dan Kevchi Sajdos Teni Dagi Junso Jibu Jindolan Page Sanji Driver Shows Lawan Takanji Lensi Nig Sorich Yodebati and Tambo Nanzuta Karswada Capture Sasanamando and Lote Sasanamando D and Tamkela Tujichimu Demitemba Kadinji Telaya Loti Juni T Tony to Kari languages Lavdigi and choosing it. Chukunjo and Chukunjo de Lendu Landante and the Yamu Yungi Gendun Kunjo Jele then Languavanza Tisum Digtonda Kanji and Nanzugi Karsawata Sosugi Debi 10 Tibigeta and it tapped the Titon seconds the Tigelia Gaps Rosusula Robaching already to Tutsugi.
So we start off this session with reciting the verse for Refuge and Bodhicitta. So we recited it in Tibetan. Looking at the English translation, it is made of two sections. So the first two lines are the first section of going for refuge. The two last lines they are dealing with developing bodhicitta and the mind of enlightenment. So we first off go for refuge, as it says, I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Supreme Assembly. So we rely upon the Buddha, the teacher, the one that we regard as a kind teacher, the one that was skilled in means. And in going for refuge to the Buddha and finding that sense of reliance, trust and reliance in the Buddha, if we wonder what are we taking on from the Buddha, well, we take on the Dhamma, which is the second object of refuge. And we also rely upon the Sangha, those that have developed an experience of how to take on the Dhamma. So since we regard them as those that develop that experience, we also rely upon them. So in that sense, we develop that mental reliance upon the three objects of refuge. We think of the meanings, and through that, we find that sense of reliance and confidence in the three objects of refuge.
들다 당한주 로종기 된다디 다 렌싱 이버디 아니 진소 집인 손놈 긴돌라 펜시 산지 드버 쇼스 라운디 간지 아니 셈켄 로제 케신 남주 트니 아니 탐칠이야 아니 펜디 드퉁인기 아니 깨우지 키로 쇼세 데려다서로 다투나 디지디다 아니 된다 님부 로종 님부디 아니 렌싱 이버디 토니 the languages, the Lojong's Laundi, Lenzing even only so the same case at Sam the Loni with the Tandachigba, Lokebas Lounding, hearts on in the Medejuchi, him by Natalia case, it's the Lego Maris. Tangazo ranchis, you debig, logic di pig, that deeper chair time sort of deeper good chair sort of layer. 아니 로종스 더 딜라고레스 로 tinza 당한 로종 코디 아니 단단히 못 딘리지레스.
And then the last two lines in this verse say, by the merits I create through listening to the teachings, but the original verse says, by the merits or by the accumulations I create through generosity and so forth. By practicing generosity and other things, might become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. So the last two lines in this verse, the one that we've just recited, encapsulate the meaning of mind training practice. The development of bodhicitta, developing our mind, developing our wisdom, improving our mind. We do that through developing bodhicitta and thinking, may I contribute to the happiness and well-being of others? May I lead them or may I set them in a state of happiness and well-being? This is the main thing that we take up in our practice of mind training. So when we look at the way that it is expressed in Tibetan language, sometimes it says that we generate the mind. This is mind generation. But when we generate our mind in that way, it does not mean to say that we're doing something that we haven't done before, as if we're creating something that was never there. So when we develop the wish to be of benefit to others in this way, it's not that we develop a wish that has never been there. It's rather that we already have naturally some wish to be of benefit to some, but we want to develop it more and more. It's like opening the gates wider open, the gates of the mind, rather than being kind of quite limited or open just narrowly. We want to open the gates and make the mind vast and extensive.
들딘자다 랭안주기 캡 템포 상기기 가르송 거레스 라운디 안주기 찌당기 안주다 속된 용래야 ranchi suyo debadi ani semgamti ro den deba ta dunga munde bigi ani samlo yo debadi sam lo chigiri imbachi song yores ta dinga takji chen shimjuk chen ya ko ratwe yo debachi nguyo ne chig chagdo asro.
The one who taught the refuge is the Buddha. And when we look at what the Buddha said and we look at other living beings, we can see that all living beings naturally, the Buddha taught in relation to their mentality and related to the mind, naturally are the same in seeking happiness and well-being and wanting to avoid suffering and pain. So it's not only that the Buddha said so, when we check it out, when we assess that, we can see the validity of that observation that the Buddha made, that all of us as living beings are the same in seeking happiness and well-being and wanting to avoid suffering.
Tinza da dire tinza di gar tengores la undi nganzu lojong na la shete gi chamzi di chamba da zewa chanju gu samsing ni da ani lojong di na la ya sheya yena mena chik chagores tinji gi chamzi gi shido di zawa do di nganzu do ri tu gi samgong la ya ranchis yo de chik tanji gi ribati dewa dewa da dungam mun dewa 균신 디톤다 drip chogores ranganzu dunghar munde bati dunghar munde bi samlo di ani sevi rangshin res devan devi samlo di chambi rangshin res kanji chambi rangshin res ta dinti gi de devan dela dunghar munde bi samlo di ani shukcher gyachir tanya yores na gyacha gyatama yo deva chagoras ra ta di jit zonda ani lojong di yungu yores.
And if we're looking what this section of teaching teaches us, well, it teaches us the development of loving kindness, love, compassion, and the mind of enlightenment. The basis of bodhicitta, the basis of bodhicitta, the mind of enlightenment, is love and compassion. And the very reason that supports or that proves that that reason with the development of love and compassion to others is the recognition that all of them, all other living beings, are the same in seeking happiness and well-being and wanting to avoid suffering and pain. So we develop compassion in wishing others to be free from suffering, and we develop love or loving kindness when we wish them to have happiness. And we already have those attitudes naturally present in our mind. In our practice of mind training, we increase them more and more. We increase the strength of wishing for living beings to have happiness and to be free from suffering, in recognizing that naturally this, or on the very basis, all of them are equal in wishing for that. This is what we take on into a practice of mind training.
Gyabden yona mena di sherab di chagol ta legni namjibi namchoti ro legbadang ngemba sedi kaso legbadang ngemba sedi nguyo nesul chigla chaguyonza di tong tungingi namjotelya ani lotelya sherab segores ta diang gyachejun gyachejam yorosro namju chejun kebayonza ta namju diang ngazugi devan debata dunga mundebati karsevarsna leg bichadiyona ani gavada milik bichadiyona magavat ta direndo asra tinza legni nambajibi namjugi bi shezadiya nganzula ranchi suyo deba chamzi gi tsawadiya nganzula ranchi suyo deba di ngo kompal tanyagi ani niba yona menadi nganzun ro mi gi tenla yan dus ro mi leba yongi tsolaya ta di namjudi Truyag niba yona men teyawanza and nganzun ro mig never do da lojong sing the chegoya chena trimdi yobach chagwanza da sanjum den di nganzula ya lojong gi tab naya kora and dinijre dos.
And as we increase, we improve our mind, we do that in being supported by our own wisdom, our own intelligence, that to begin with is capable of making distinctions between what is positive, what is negative, what is good, and what is bad. So we, for example, recognize sentient beings. We recognize, for example, what is positive and what is negative in relation to reality, and that seeing what is positive or what is negative is what we call wisdom or intelligence. And we have different strengths or different levels of intelligence. So, for example, in relation to happiness and suffering, we can say that, for example, happiness is positive, suffering is negative. We develop a sense of liking or affinity with what is positive and a dislike to what is negative. So we can develop our wisdom to be able to identify that in a stronger and stronger, or better and better way. So this type of wisdom is present for us naturally, and also the love that we have to others and wishing them to have happiness and to be free from suffering is already there naturally. But what we need to do is to increase the strength of our wisdom and the love that we have to others. And we have the ability to do so because we were born as human beings. We have a body that supports us in an intelligent consciousness that can be developed further on. So we take on the development of our wisdom and love and compassion in our practice of mind training. Not only we need to, you can say, to take it on because we have the basis for doing it in this life, being born as human beings. Not only we need to do it, but we are capable of doing it.
대대한 딱지 아니 다가스 가르스고다 셰샤마이바 딱지 심주 제니 네번이 되버치 얘는 세리바기 딱지 지원한신로 안주기 남비 쇼나로야 드팅코르 시기요리 드팅기 차락 거다 드팅 체중 거다 마부슈 송여마도 드팅 춘중기 네바 utolaya 까뮤디 배시 매교로지레스로 드팅 춘중질이야 드팅 춘중 쇼질이야 변하다 셀더스다 드팅 춘중질이야 콜레 네바 카리어스야지 여러다 디 변나 세리비기 드팅 돌이야 쇼주지온 세리비기 드팅 춘중 비기 아니 쇼지 니기요 마세 델이야 아니 네바 칸드지에메다 콘주 아니 심주치에니다 니기요라서 디난신기 만주기 잠지기 짜와디 란치스 유메기 톨이야 심주치네 란치스 여바디 니 니바자마세 안 디츠 콤플타나 네바 가주 쳔부 샤투 유메 아니 로 미츠마이바 아니 소차 요도 졸이야 펜디드 퉁인 네바 차기 여바디 아니 남비기다 세리버선한다 점점된 디고 우트비기 갸가르기 아니 펜루츠다 네번인 당한줄이야 떼샤바 임바디 답비스우로 지어스라.
And it's not only that we make those statements, that we have the ability to develop our wisdom, we have the ability to develop love, loving kindness and compassion to others. We can check it out for ourselves. We can check it out. We can assess that. We can analyze that. And through that, to find conviction in our ability to do so. And the type of analysis and investigation that we take on into our potential of developing wisdom and love and compassion and so forth is similar to some degree to the analytical process that we take when we take on when we engage with science. So when you look at, for example, the explanation of the Buddhist tradition with respect to the external world. So the Buddhist tradition speaks of things being made of parts, and then parts have smaller parts, but still the explanation is not as detailed as, of course, what you find in science, going into subatomic levels and speaking about then at some point when you break down atoms into particles and particles into particles, and you start to deal with energies or energetic level and so forth. You don't find that detailed explanation in Buddhist tradition, but still, when you look at the approach to analysis and investigation, you can see similarities between the two. So likewise, when we look at our approach to, first of all, the statement that we have innately, naturally, a degree of wisdom, an degree of loving kindness and compassion, and we can develop them further on, then we take it on into our analysis and investigation. We see whether we can identify or recognize the wisdom and the love and compassion that we have naturally or innately within us, and whether they can be increased and developed further on, particularly for us as human beings having a body that supports a consciousness, that supports the development of wisdom. We can, through a process of analysis and investigation, identify that and develop conviction in our ability to develop our wisdom and love and concern to the point in which we can also be of benefit to others, and also helping others, benefiting others in developing greater degrees of happiness and well-being. So the Buddha taught the way to do that, and led by the Buddha, the Bhagavan, we also have Indian masters that evolve through different points in time, and also in great details, great precision, describe the mental process of developing our mind in this way.
Terda din zada da chiza da dindigi chamze kompal tanya gyabden rawdi namju lengyi namba jibi namju set chagora da lengyi namba jion di legba da ngemba seti anita pigi chomden digi ta drup shisha chini devan deva da dunga mendeba ani dori tu chigyu yimba di shisha ni lengyi ani chisul chigda manzu dindigi ta drup da and dinti lo kaya majang be kita jik ani chitang ga ta ani mi jigding tolaya ani lengi chadang yi budi tes ji kheba yung go res ro manzu penata jik namasan ji ta du da dinti la kaya machang ji ba na ani legba se na suzu la ya pigi la deji chra ba na ro luchol le tembi dewa ina re semzo le tembi ne ko dewa ji yung go ba na leg bi chat sigros 내가 마대바 jingoen di milik bicha tsigiros ina sanji bi shon la ya lengni di tetsam gu ton mishawa ro neka dewa ina ya tatuk la ya negu yoba ina dungar chimbu chin renji chaga yoba ina di milik bala ya tsi neka kaduk dang donlen che goya chi yinba ina ya ten du dewa roya chi ki tab chaga yoba ina di lek bicha la ya tsi ni tenji gi lengni je chi ni ane namju 아니 참지 중요하디 된리지 돈 송고도 싫어.
So our goal is to develop, to increase the love, the concern that we have to others. And in order to do that, we use the wisdom or the intelligence that can well distinguish and discern between what is positive and what is negative, what is good and what is bad. And the Buddha, the Bhagavan, taught that with respect to living beings, sentient beings of the 6 realms of existence, which are equal in seeking happiness and well-being and wanting to avoid suffering. So the Buddha taught in relation to that different philosophical views. He taught philosophical views, and when we look at the philosophical views and the practices that the Buddha described, then you can get a sense of the positive and the negative that the Buddha referred to. But we also have things in the world that we regard as positive or negative, as good, as bad. So for example, if we try to imagine a scenario in which the Buddha's teachings are not available at all, and what would be the idea of what is positive or negative, what is good or what is bad, not in relation to what the Buddha said, then you can say that in general, whatever type of happiness or pleasure that we have, even if it's just kind of physical pleasure, that's considered to be in general positive. Pain is regarded as negative. But then when you look at it from the perspective of the Buddhist teachings, well, there's some levels of pleasure or comfort that we experience on a physical level that we might otherwise consider to be positive or good things. But then from another perspective, if you look at it from some Buddhist perspective, some temporary levels of happiness can bring about great suffering in the future. And therefore, even though you can say that it is temporary pleasure, temporary happiness, we don't regard it as positive, as we regard it as negative if it leads to suffering. Or vice versa. It might be that for the time being, you're going through hardship, but then through that hardship, there is a potential of developing happiness in the future, or from that hardship, happiness, well-being will arise in the future. So although currently it is regarded as hardship, still from a Buddhist perspective, we regard that as positive.
강가 춘주지는 전부 통대야지. 아니 대저 동가 마부 뇽대지로. 담미 개침부 지다야. 부타 림부지려야 상무다니. 아니 내가 제바이나 총착 차만지 위리야 동len 치 투야치 그 용도 용거데 남매 땅 투야키 그즈스 그 남매 땅 투가 티츠기 동가 리디 뇽 용거자 아니 대기 드당기 대기 대당 치바 있나야 드당 그 탑라 만다시 돈 당한줄에 대기 드당디 송구여레스라 돌되는 간주 대기 드당기 탑지 송구여레스 딘디지레샤스라.
If you wonder what are we actually talking about? Well, we're talking about our objectives, our goals. If our objective, our goal is only limited to short-term goals, short-term pleasure, when we encounter slight difficulties, small problems, if our goals are just too short-term, small things become quite massive in our mind. Whereas if our objective, if our goal is a long-term goal, and we work in order to secure this long-term goal, we'd be able to take on difficulties and problems and ignore them. And through that, our happiness and well-being will increase. And this is a really special method to develop a happiness and well-being, rather than to focus only on the short term, to start to develop long-term goals in terms of happiness and well-being.
dan David Tony manzu semla ya kanga shuj chede chi ta dinji di ngu chunyi yimba chi ani ngeba ni thungi jimba na ku chunyi re asamondi ani gyo dan David Tony ani kadu nyomo go chi kanji dinji je sungu do asra tetu nganzu mesen ala ya ngebor di shingo ya do chi.
And also together with that, we also recognize that the world is constantly going through different changes. And this is the nature of things, to go through changes and transformations, but we fail to recognize that, and without recognizing that, our mind finds it difficult to deal with the changes that occur around us. But then when we remind ourselves that this is the nature of the world, we become convinced that this is the nature of things around us, the nature of change. When changes do occur, you don't experience so many difficulties, mental difficulties in dealing with them. This is something that we have to understand, how the nature of things around us is a nature of change.
동아 슈크쳔부 슈크 아니 게드온디게 다야 게드온디게 나사만부 란싱글레데바 딘디컬레야 간두 미셈레야 강가만부 용구여라스라 데는 타마 친르 갑둘레야 아니 야 하장이 지그라 친부 딘디 에 용구여레스 더 두수기 아니 다 기비 갑두다 아니 개왕하신도지 켈렌 드론 슈기야나 기비 갑두 동아디 뇽르 투에지 용구라스 당한두 단디 차라야 안주 게드온디게 게드와디 춘이 임바이나야 게비 갑둘레야 지 셈레야 강가마용 탑시 야자야담바 혼전 땅이여데바 사드디 치갈라모델이야 아니 직자슈 직토니 치무고와 로데부 징아니 치르야지 삼로 단단히 종아요레스 다 디송고도 아스라 디 간줄레야 네버도 고야지.
And for us, when we look at the difficulties that we experience in our own mind, the greatest difficulties that we experience is through a process of birth, in which there is a lot of suffering in birth, and then through the process of aging. And at the end, through aging, we also become sick. And at the end, we approach the time of death. And there's so many problems and difficulties that we experience throughout that process. Great fear arises in our mind when we approach death. So if we make effort in thinking of past and future lifetimes, that's one way of reducing the degree of mental angst and suffering that we experience when we go through this process of suffering. When we age, there's a way for us to reduce the mental pain or mental suffering. When we die, if we work on a mind, there's a way for us to die with a comfortable mind, with a mind that is at ease, rather than a mind that is completely beset by fear. Not only we have the ability to do so, we have to do it.
ngamzu chinruwe kolaya ani dunga ngamra di kandaji yungu yores lawandi peshi dendro jinsares anzu ani amju drama ko mik su mando khani keje shego samna she matu ina sam lapi sama thende khadulaya ta deni ani lu da ngag tone khaya che matu sam laya chilyawandi deni ngamra shuch ta pena guju jagona japtugo mara in tilka ngamra shu yungyasares ra tendri khadulaya samlo jitamaduna shu ngamra khorang thone ani so che goya dindri jaji yadamata yungyares.
So thinking of a state of fear that could arise being on the verge of death. So in one scenario, for example, we can think of how when the body is getting closer and closer to the point of death and the organs start to shut down, then we cannot hear anymore, our auditory faculty declines. We can no longer talk. We can no longer see clearly things around us. And it is possible that our mind is still active. We can still think. So how terrifying it can be when a body is shutting down, but our mind still works. We can still think. If we don't have any particular thing that we can think of, or a method that will be helpful at that time, it is very possible that the mind will be completely overcome with fear, and that the moment of death will be a moment that we will experience great fear. It is possible for something like that to occur.
pama chaba inanda tamadele katendro batiko jigding chunyi ba kanji dinji tolaya ani ngeba ni tugoya ta ani chi soso devirin la ya ani chi rangi deva deki günzen de soni shenla ya sewa che deva ram medeva günzen de cheni shenla ya neba tang deva kanji dinji gi sewi sewa dan devi gi chawa kan batele ya ani 동네 체체 강고체니 간지 잠지 가주스기 잠지를 때는 좋도 봐이나 아니 집이 갑들라야 로데부 체체 파베부친 비기다 지 아니 수비기 니베기 다 우다 체로 와데니야 샘나로라야 파베부친이 아니 드레 용거리스 다디 냠뇽 톤다 숭고요레스로 nganzri jeto banda ani mesedi godne yaxshu di chagores.
So what can we do now in relation to that? Well, first off, we can recognize that whatever is born will necessarily die. This is the nature of things in the world. Whatever is born will necessarily die. Every meeting will end in separation. So we think about it in terms of our relationship. We think about it in terms of the people in our family. At the end of every birth, there will be death, right? So when people that are close to you pass away, your parents and such, well, this is something that that is important to recognize, that at the end of every birth, there will be death, and at the end of every meeting, there will be separation. So you acquaint your mind with that throughout your life, and you think that this is the nature of the world. And when you find conviction in thinking that this is the nature of the world, this is the nature of our relationship as human beings, then you develop a sense of love and concern for others. And you come to see that it is not right for me to harm others just in order to get my happiness. It is not okay to harm others in order to get what I want. So we stop acting in this way, and as much as we can, we try to develop a sense of love and care for others. So if we then recognize that this is the nature of the world, and we use that in order to live a life in which, as much as possible, we abstain from harming others and we develop love and concern for others, then there's such a greater chance that at the time of death or dying, as some body will lose its power, our body will decline, then our mind will be much more at ease in thinking of the life that we have lived. At least those that have developed an experience in sustaining the state of mind, developing that state of mind, have spoken about the benefit in thinking about those matters and living a life in this way. So there is a great purpose for us to train our mind in this way.
그래서 진짜 산지점된 되게 따르도 된다고 저러 파 가주스기 밀레 야부치에 투어 뒤쪽이 소주 수 대기 용야지. 파 잠재 때 투바나 수 잠재 땅이 망으로 용되버지. 딘리제도서 파 펜도 가주치에 투바 뒤쪽이 수 가부칭이 망 용되지. 파 레야 소소레야 누바여바당 즉 소소 비기 딘리 균센도 체네 아니 셴레야 아니 네버치바이나 아니 남주영의 랭이 제통의 장수영의 참을로디 수수 갑대 차려야지 수수야 마가와 차려야지 그러니까 통고도 서로 마가야딩이 있다 콜롬바레야 유여바다 피기 바르지여바 균센지니 미션 또원디 엔 잠블링기 아니 장대 만시야 아니 롬바들레야 마가와 차려도 롬바디 펜조 냠르야 롬바디 미셀레 강간 체데 옹송 통데야디 산지점된 디로 니동 주기 권이 비기게 송샤주지 레드도스라.
So in terms of the Buddhist view, the Buddhist way of thinking, if you treat others well, they will reciprocate that and you will be treated well. If you treat others with love and compassion, you will also be treated with love and compassion. If you harm others, if others have the wisdom, the skill, the intelligence, and the power, they will also harm you in return. And we can see that particularly at the present day, when we look at wars and conflicts around the world, you might have a country that is powerful, that has an arsenal of ammunition, and then it attacks another country. When others recognize that to be dishonest, not a fair way of acting, then they react with either sanctions, economical sanctions, and so forth. So we can see that the Buddha 2,600 years ago spoke exactly about that, how if you treat others in a good way, in a positive way, you will be treated back in this way. If you harm others, you will also be harmed yourself.
그래서 대세 간시 로종 님보로디 소수 귤레여비 소수레여 귤레야다 누바 행기 누바여비 아니 잠제 슈크치르타야 남주 슈크치르타야디 아니 로종게 다 님보로디 테레스라 테레스다 딘지 로종 체발야 단다다 안지 갑두 슈바이나 시발 로종 남진 다음에 제비 담직 남 템번 세드레.
Okay. So anyway, as we're looking now at the text that is explaining the way to train our mind, the mind training text, it first of all recognizes that we have a natural ability to train our mind, and we increase our ability through those instructions for loving kindness and compassion to others. So having said that, we're now going to go back to the text and pick up from the point that we left off in the previous session. So we're looking at mind training like the rays of the sun. I'm just going to sort out the text, just a second. Where is it? Just a second. 나중에 제조처럼.
제 럭처리
나중에 제조처럼. Okay. Bingo. All right.
럭식 사실 럭 로존은 다음에 집에 담직 땜받는 들리니 텐센트바 찌지기 땜받니 치든선라 따돌로 지송디 로존 캘렌단가 마임바 로존 털초송 마소와 로존 초그려 마임바.
All right, so let's look at the irreversible commitments of mind training. This section has two parts, the explanation of what appears in the text in verse and what appears in the text as maxims. First off, the explanation of what appears in the text in verse begins with quoting a line from the 7-point mind training, always training in 3 general points. Now it says, these are as follows: mind training that is not contrary to the commitments, which is not led astray, and which is impartial.
다들이 디치디기다 다들 넘버 지크야 시샤 진다 송거라서 넘버 인슬라운디 아니 캠루켈렘바 슬라운디 아니 무기주봉기 수좀 레야 캘렌델레야 네바질레야다 무기주봉기 수좀기 dombalaya ningijilaya number series ta migi chubung chudum laya kelen nebe kapdulaya ta di gi ani damsik songoya mambushu so di ani kareres launta shala neba sheda cheba dombi dombas laundi ta shala chewa cheba so shala news laundi shala ya chewa chagun na shala nebara ta dinji neba tamu sunjeni ani 손님 로고그레스 로 캘렌더가 많이 봐서 딘디 네버 참을 때도 친주지라 삼삼도지 젠니 남의 땅샤 많이 봐 친중디 첨부차요라서 아니 첨부차는 얘가 첨부차고라서 딘자 그 친중 권네 예바 임바이나 아니 친중니 봐 매버서야 돌아야다 동네치는 로고에 고단 들여도서
So when it begins with mind training that is not contrary to the commitments. So this text gives an explanation taking into consideration that the target audience of this text is Buddhists. So as Buddhists, our commitment, first off, is in terms of going for refuge. So we have gone for refuge, we accept refuge, and therefore we also have a commitment to abide by the ethical discipline that abstains from the 10 non-virtues. We live or we get by in abstaining from the 10 non-virtues. And there are so many pleasures involved with developing that ethics that abstains from the 10 non-virtues. But when we look at the summation of them, we are abstaining from harming others on the basis of that harm. So this is what we need to abstain from. We need to abstain from harming others. So that in terms of the approach that we develop for abstaining from harming others, we might look at some activities and think that it doesn't really matter. It's just a small thing. It doesn't matter if I do it, even if it's harmful. It's not a biggie. It's just a small thing. Well, if we develop that approach to guarding ethical discipline, it is likely that if we're going to become dismissive of small things, we'll end up also committing greater things. So here, when we abide by our commitments, we try as much as we can also to keep away from the small things, to refrain from even small negative actions which are harmful to others.
re namjing anzu da ji danganzu mi gi rodang rojli ya ji chunjung ji re samna namme tang sha joros di kyuni nganza lojong tola xiaondi te be nyenga tsaw insares ro pena pena ta ji genye phama inandra ani getsul phama inandra gelon phama ani chanju sembe dombal newe shemogo ba ani ditsugi tsawi gi tondi tsawi gi nyeba di sonya di 송 투고랬다 망치야 송 투고랬 근데 예바 참여리지 배나 게츠롱도 지금 봐이나 아니 예바 참여리디 남의 체제니 아니 예바디 아니 예마 딱봐 아니 주주 딱봐야 예비 그야 돼야지 딘지 그 봐이나 아니 예바디 잡첨부 쇼식 차야기 년가 요레스 그러 인자 예바 참여디 송 투야디 깔카오연자 깔카오들이야 돈은 셰도 봐이나 체사디 아니 아니 뷰 타고 쇼차야지 인고서레스로 나 춘중딜이야 남의 쇼바이나 체디 비기게 가서다 드마징 거 소로지 간지 뷰 마다와지 어딘지 차로도 왔어
So for us, sometimes as human beings, we look at things which could be quite minute or trivial, and we think that it doesn't really matter. If I do that, it doesn't really matter. Well, this type of attitude is dangerous for a mind training practice. So we might be holding vows, like for example, we might be holding the refuge vow. We might be ordained, either novices or fully ordained men, women. No, all of us have sets of vows. So if we think that it doesn't really matter, the small things that the small things do not really matter. Well, we have a capacity to abstain from the things which are the root things in the vows that we have. Of course, we can add to that also the Bodhisattva vow. So we have the capacity to abstain from the root things within the vow. But if we become dismissive of the points which are more subtle in the precepts that we have, if we ignore them, if we become dismissive, then daily those faults will increase and at the end will become quite big. Whereas if we try to, as much as we can, to keep away from even the small things, to abstain from these small bits, we'll also become quite good and skilled in abstaining from the things that are major. So if we're not gonna, if we not at least try to do that, then things could fall apart for us or deteriorate in terms of our mind training, in terms of keeping up with our commitment.
제베나 다드니야 냠네 센동 송디 녜바 참모도서 로 베게 녜바 참모도서 빵가야치 로 녜바 참모니 다투 바이나 녜바 참모디 다투 바이나 아니 장마차로 해서라 녜바 참모들이야 님부 숙천슈 된데 관심자 안간주 춘중을 삼체니 남의 땅대디 자원이니 되니 안간주 가서다 란도르 내려야 슈니 아니 최징인 지금은 삼다나 아니 춘중을 삼체니 아니 남의 땅에디 자원이니 되니 딩매바지 송고도 왔어 산단절로.
So if we neglect the things which are more simple or smaller in the things that we need to abstain from, our training will become solid. So if we commit those small faults, it would be hard to give them up, to abandon them. And therefore, our training in ethical discipline will not become pure. Whereas if we work, to purify it, to clean up this mode of behavior, then just small antidotes would be required to things which are trivial. So if we pay attention to that, to even small things, apply antidotes to small things, then we can keep up with our training in what needs to be taken up and what needs to be cast aside. If we do not abide by that, if we think that it doesn't really matter, it's just a small thing, it's not really proper, it's not okay in terms of what we need to do and what we ought not to do in relation to our trainings.
예, 당분이 다 로종 캘렌단가 많이 봤어야지. 왜자 로종아 임비 디쌈기 문느 세니 제바 참무 캐도 써봤다. 로종 디어나 신지에 무그세니 태바지 랑렌단가와 제바남 때 머자와. 더 까리간에서 산기 따지 도바니 첸 담보피기 따지 돈바니 첸이 타르 피기기다 아니 냠랭가 타트바다 가르송여번 디파르드 참마베 까리간에 싸운 디버멘치 산지 템버 조시 냠슬렘발라 라버차오스.
Looking at what our text is saying, it says, firstly, that's in relation to mind training that is not contrary to the commitments. Firstly, we should never act in contradiction to the practices common to all vehicles, saying, there is no harm in this because I'm training the mind. When we break some minor commitments, claiming that nothing else is required of a follower of mind training. On the contrary, we should train in practicing the Buddhist teachings in its entirety, from the instructions on basic logic or from the instructions on the Vinaya, the way to tame our behavior, up to the tantric teachings of such as Guya Samaja Tantra.
단들이다 니게 빼로디 가르스는데 주시 냠슬렘발라 라버차오스. 안주 주시 짐바에나다 술시 촉시다 다 여러와서라 다 딘티지เป็น람가 부수 토부지니 아니 사크 냠부지야 키고 여바나 람가네 키온디 주시디 술 찬잔니 땐 야 마키바나 술치 다바나 주시디 견쇼도 그랬다. 다 술시 촉시니 아니 가리 연구도 쌈로 땅이야 키고와 난신기 만주 켈란샤비 동바디야 촉 탐체니 쌈당 거를 모두 피기 짜거든 게 송유더니 셴바 가르총도 총 상수지는 저나 싸우니는 지금 말이스 레투사들 레그마 레고사들 레그마리스 야부진 레그마리스로 디순 거다 인규들다.
So here it says, on the contrary, we should train in practicing the Buddhist teachings in its entirety, from the instructions on basic logic up to the Guya Samaja Tantra. Now, looking at the way that it's expressed in Tibetan, when it says we should train in practicing the Buddhist teachings in its entirety, the Tibetan version says that we should practice this, you could say, the square box of the Buddhist teachings. And when Geshe says that, looking at this square box that is mentioned, or the square teachings that the text mentions, no, it has sides, right, left, or north and south. It's like if you're traveling along a road and there's a really narrow passage and you're holding in your hand this box, square box, and you need to make sure that there's no damage that it sustains. If you're going to hold it in a crooked way, right? So if the ground is even or uneven, if you hold it in a crooked way and you need to get it through a narrow passage, there's a danger that one of the sides will be damaged. So you need to be really careful. So also here, when we think of how we tread carefully in our practice, we should always make sure that we do not incur faults in relation to the training. So as it says here, on the contrary, we should train in practicing, maybe you can say fair and square. We should train in practicing fair and square the Buddhist teachings in its entirety, from the instructions on the basic logic up to the Guya Samaja Tantra.
데르다 데네 로종 털쪽 송 많이 봤어요. 이거 로종 민다 균선도 제네 산연고 신이죠. 신이죠. 거네 강에서 제메든로 당념 제발 지 계속다 따주던 바꾼도 방식 조천볼 힌직네 제일 힌직네 탐진캠버 중가보야 시기팔 가규 넘버 답에 제술라버 차오스.
And then it says, secondly, we should avoid digging harmful earth, felling sinister trees, stirring nauseous waters, visiting those afflicted by contagious diseases without precaution, or associating by view or behavior with those who are morally corrupt or possessed by spirits. We should follow the pure and unbroken tradition descending from the great Atisha, the sole divine Lord, to the all-knowing Tsongkhapa and his disciples. So this section is an explanation of the second point, how we practice mind training, which is not led astray.
다 디게 도도도 가르친 거를 라운데로 산년 중년다 고트 말다 도도 가르친 것은 가 비게 로종 지기스 랍치니 아니 무수치다 만통 받치는 로데바이나 코유다 만통 받치는 로데바이나 디그마레스 디 용해요 마레스 로종 언니 로종 지기여바나 아니 밀레야 뛴고도 아스라 넘버 3집이 로종 디나니 로종 세디 태버침비 추기 아니 민지레도 왔다 로종 세디 라 팅밍기 람냠닝 걸려 로종 세디 지 용어마다 로종 세디 태버침비 추기 민지레스 태버침비 추도 쪼디 젠라야 참닌지다야 젠라야 참닌지다서인데 젠라 뛰는 거지 라 젠바실라야 뛰는 거지 수수기 비 내급기 경라가 경케진 아니 셴라야 케테니 drogo야디 로종기다 님보러 왔어 진짜 셴라 만드는 dro바이나 아니 자원이는 디겨 말했어 자원이는 디겨 말했어
So there are a few words and terms that came up in this section. Some of those words or terms are a little bit obscured, so we're not gonna look at each and every term. But in brief, if we think of briefly what this section is saying, well, here when we practice mind training, we don't practice it in a way that we have to be in agreement, to act in agreement with wherever we meet or wherever we are, in a sense that it's not that our behavior is compromised to the point in which we act in a way that is completely in agreement with others. For when we practice mind training, first of all, we do recognize that we do depend upon others. We are reliant upon others, we depend upon others. And particularly here, when we use this term mind training, or in Tibetan lojong, it is a term that is given to a particular tradition within the Buddhist teaching, which is the Mahayana tradition. So we're practicing Mahayana Dhamma. Mind training here in this context is the Mahayana Dhamma practice, where we recognize that the fundamentals of our practice is the development of love and compassion towards others, and recognizing that we do depend upon others, that we are reliant upon others. So that since we do depend upon others, so if we are reliant upon others, then if our practice is based on love and compassion, then even if there would be a situation in which we will lose something or we will be at fault, we're still going to take it on in developing love and concern for others. So it is not right for us to think that we are unreliant, we are independent from others.
이카들라야 좀 소리 직 쉬운도스라 간스나 ngakpa chawat sengi bachi ni nyam dores koni nyam drone ta ngakpa dige gyunden la ya ta ngakpa chogi chi zangzo mendong do shu chi go da zangzo namzo mendong do ani karitu na sayala soba karitu na kanyala soba chen ta drogo ta ngone ta chi ngakpa jin ba na ani kanya zangzo sem din zangzo ta go mares 다 딘지 투니 아니 다 코니 냠도 칼라스는 투벅거 그랬어 투벅거 온디게 투벅디 약부에 차서디 ngak바디게 남도 면동도 치니 딘나로라야 함고에나 지 누그서 투벅나 안 차바디게 답변이 짜자지가 하고 한 계란 나오도 매번 빼야버린 알아 당진지에 메슬라지 두번들 농자 쉬신 쉬샤랬어. But this is it. 찍실라 맞든 봐이나. 나 딘디 차로 거스. 딘디 송고도 니kanzo 가르나지 고개에 미시러. 나는 게무샹겐도지다디.
So the Tibetan tradition is very much a tradition of storytelling. So there's one anecdote, one story that is told in relation to how we depend upon each other. So it's sort of kind of at least in the Tibetan tradition is a funny story. How funny it will be for us, let's see. So it is telling about two guys that we hang out with each other. So one of them was a mantrika. So let's call them a yogi, right? So yogi that practices mantra, and the other one was like a serious monk, a fully qualified monk. So they were hang out together. Now, so this yogic, this tantric yogi, this mantrika, was behaving as if he got rid of all such conceptions about good or bad or clean and unclean, clean and dirty. So the type of behavior that I was displaying is that, you know, if you travel somewhere and you encounter something that is filthy or dirty, and if he was like without hesitation, he would pick it up and put it in his mouth or eat it and so forth, as if he has no conceptions of clean or unclean whatsoever. Anyway, one day as they were hanging out together, they were cooking tukpa, like traditional Tibetan soup. So this yogi, when the soup was ready, he picked up a shoe and just threw it into the soup, as if like, it's completely okay because I'm free from having any thoughts of clean and unclean. So even if you have like a dirty shoe in your soup, it doesn't really matter, I can eat it. Well, the monk responded to that, kicking the pot, and says, well, it's okay to kick, to kick the pot, spill the soup, because I have no grasping at that pot. Anyway, Tibetan is a little bit funny. English, I guess that's not that much.
데려다 다드네 숨바 로준 초그리 와서 마송하세 데려다 로준 초그리 왔다 남경 안주 초그리 로야기 로 초그리 로야디 착당 몬송부터 남비 쇼는시원디 착당 몬송부터니 아니 율직래야 착 율직래야 당 율직래야 가서다 아니 따냠 남에 따냐로 써봐 딘디 용구여라서 the dintri mandroj one lojon chingin bayna sama ranyam ta tu koyach so then we shizang ngoma de devan deba dungaman de rand shen sama lon ranyam inza and didn't tumba ta tu koyat kichambures.
Now the last point is mind training, which is impartial. Now, when we practice in a way that is impartial, we practice it without being subject to anger, attachment, and ignorance. In that, when we look at the attitude that we sustain with respect to others, because of anger, attachment, and ignorance, we classify others as friends, enemies, and strangers, or in-betweeners. Mind training, which is impartial, is not subject to this classification of others as being close to our heart, distant from our heart, those that we neglect due to anger, attachment, and ignorance. It is a practice that is applied equally to everyone.
잠인지 제다매봐 곰구비체로스.
So thirdly, the text says it's quite clear, we should be impartial about the object of our mind training, whether it is human or inhuman, friend, foe, or stranger, superior, inferior, or equal, or higher, middling, or low. This is because we should practice compassion without distinction towards all sentient beings under the sky.
terda 균제 약슈 디디네 거여다 라 참말로야 잠바데 닌지 고무고 사치 요 말스 메비치스로 그냥 초그리 메바 참말로야 따고지 아니 잠바데 닌지 고무고 사치 메비스 숨진 탐제려야
Well, this section provides us this really excellent, faultless reason for practicing without partiality. The reason for that is that because we should practice compassion without distinction towards all sentient beings, which means that there's not even a single sentient being that should be excluded from a practice of love and compassion. And because of that, we should practice with an impartial attitude.
대장한 주기 로라 마숑안도지 다 탐제라야 인지 공고레스 라운디 당한 주디 내든도 마시나 베나다 아니 롱바시안라야 막야딩기 주 밑에 다 독습진 슈치 다 차고로스 다 델야 인지 공고레스 라바이나 로유라야 마숑안도지 가서 그 말업 슈치 제거다 이나야 인지곰 마곰세디 내가 그게 아니 저발이야 따야 마이바 그 랭기게 랑 랭기게 비 샘곰래야 랑신래야 되니 랑신 세월다 제 텔라 되니 인지곰 고모고 송고라스 그게 미셴발이야 가주스 독습 지기여 봐야냐 그 랑신래야 참지여 되었지 콜레야 참지 공인지긴 받지 그 대원 누구 여봐 그 동안 누구 매바디 타 줘반자 콜레야 동안 고면서 그 동안도 타바디 그 내로도 통받지 의신 삼바진자 그 동안도 때는 찌마로 냠비기 제와디 양고 받지 그래스.
One difficult point in this section states that we should practice compassion without distinction towards all sentient beings under the sky, towards everyone. So particularly in this point in time, when we look at the world around us, and we can see now that there are places in the world which are affected by war. So there is an aggressor and there is a victim. So when we think about developing compassion towards the aggressor, someone that is waging war against someone else, particularly leaders and so forth, how do we practice compassion towards them? We think that actually this is completely not suitable to practice compassion with someone like this. They are so ill-mannered. They're such a bad person. It's not actually suitable to practice compassion towards someone like that. Well, here the text says that we should practice compassion without distinction towards all sentient beings in recognizing, regardless for the time being of their kind of what they're doing, we think of this innate or natural state of mind that they have mentally, naturally. They still have a wish to be well, to be happy. Since naturally, innately in the mind, they have that thought, may I be happy? It is real, or it makes sense to think, may they be happy.
Today, these are the cook, they would do you about that. Don't do me about it. Geshe Yatamaro, that Pigita, Lombalea, Mark Yangi, they were diggy, Pombadi, Samgon on Laya, and Mark the Chushu, Dava Mongolea, Mark Yag, Chutan, Susulea, kept sound down. Digigi samni chegorata ani dian ko bigi tanga su sanju tunga da nyima khashi jig na lo ya pedi ani yakal lenchi ni che jago samya samalo mashi bi mombe wanki tamadele ya ma jawn da dawa droba na ya suzula yakame ba mase ani kyong shuji ra dewa di ko mashi mombe wanki yimba chi sorba na yacha gyada ba da ninje rang 마도 델야지 콘트로게 고야다 딘디 내로 짜니는 매교치 그라 다민 남주진 직선함도 모연내술 때바는 딘디 통고래스라 진짜 닌제랑 상담한다 아니 고 모연내술은 통바치 내가 된장소를 차고래스.
So particularly when we think of someone going to war and thinking that it's just going to take a few days and I'll be able to have victory. Now we see that particularly now in the war. I guess Geshe is referring to the war between Russia and Ukraine. So, thinking initially that will just take a few days, it's already a few weeks, more than a month, and there's so much distraction visited upon others. So when we think of people, find people that are caught in that situation, when we think of the aggressor in that situation, well, the mind is confused. The mind is ignorant in thinking that I shall obtain victory, my situation will improve, it will bring about happiness and well-being, I shall be happy. None of that came to pass, and none of that came to pass because of ignorance and confusion with respect to reality. So if you think just about that, being confused, being ignorant with respect to reality, well, someone that is ignorant, that is confused with respect to reality, is an object of compassion.
Yeah.
Paul is asking, Geshe, what about things like creating pollution by driving cars unnecessarily and other things without considering the consequences or alternatives? If you ignore these small things, is that also a doorway to ignoring the bigger consequence and harms? Dila kanangi bagachila ninga chunchun yame tawaina. 소소 페나데 켈렌치 연어로 아니 내가 춘춘대서 이암 남에 땅와이나 아니 차디 저러저러 로그레스 직라인 봐 지선 다가난신 고랑기 캐시 소소 켈레 마임바 타베나 코리육 때와이나 맞소 카사칼라 모도 당기요레 산산 돔에베 돔 메나양 파솔 조게레디 케요마데 내가 첨부 말에 스나운 당와이나 아니 딜라테네 코리 초라 조게로 아니 감속바 롱감속바 딜라속바 용와이나 디안 내가 춘춘된데 야메 따얀디 틱바된다고 지치기 여러배 지기만 그런 삼나스
패시 게시게 라다이네야 당간즈 dakka tuya roji kakburen to asro mazo du steondigi ngongi mitsoge choje da nan shin roina ani kuyu de zangma shoji degorata densa mitsoge susugi mezenalola ya sayan toyan dangba zamgi jigba de chetugo marda ta geje cheda tebe samlo shoji ani dicheondigi ranshing koyugla nödroyachi dichagdo asro.
Yeah, Geshe agrees with you. But still, kind of when we think of the way that we live our life now, we do indeed so many things which are unnecessary. When we compare the way that we live now to how people used to live before a time of old, it seems that our state of mind in general of human beings is that whatever we have now is not enough. We always want more and more. It's hard to get to the point where you think that I have enough to live, I have enough to eat, I have enough to wear, and so forth. This is the mentality of people in the world that we live in at the moment.
nanganzu lombal degoras susu lombal dego kaptula ani susu chatonsa di susu ken drogoras kao in susu ken drogor sing probaji ngal sing susu gi ambanal chu ken drogor tabi mazan jodi tin chalugre an chalu chatonsa di chedajta an ambanal ken drogor dindi jingi bayna ya ani nganzu khuyula ya ta mi saman dindi chishebana shu pendo yosarwas ro 단다 요마라서 단다 차통서디 단다 지워지고 그러다 다 딘디기다 아니 잠블링 맥 타만 두시 쳐봐나 디 코랑 토는 아주 쿠유래야 슈지 내견 주고요 봐 쿠유스는 아주 잠블링 도도치거리 디마도 요마 디 톨라 칸 요바 디 딜 니비기 무츠 론지 쳐야 들어왔어 디 원이게 계란 론지 니마지래야 칼란 딘디지센 줘봐나 Zambalin di na yo joya go loto di lon dindi dangares. The Choran di Damat Samasi, Pame dindi tamena, di Daya di lon dindi nyon droger said, Geshe Yadam Sobachi to Ajeras. In the Sobachi took yore, and those Pame Longe Chevana, Zambalin the Jobu Trolla Droya, Tonkin Laya, Tonging terrible so in it, Tanto Piggy, Zambalingi, Ranjon come to Zemotegorasra.
When Geshe was growing up in Tibet, before he left Tibet, when you had your own bowl or cup for drinking tea, you went to see friends or family, you always brought your cup with you. Actually, it's not a cup, it's like a bowl, right? So it's a traditional Tibetan bowl. You put it in your pocket, kind of inside your shirt. You go and see some friends, you pull out your wooden bowl, they put some tea, you drink your tea, then after that you wipe it and put it back in your pocket. So everyone that was the standard in Tibet when Geshe was growing up. And now obviously it's different, since that no one is carrying the cup or the bowl around. So that could be kind of one sign or evidence of how we completely neglect those things which are trivial. When we look at our attitude as human beings at the moment, then we live in a consuming society. We consume more and more and more without thinking of consuming just according to our needs. So for example, if there is a certain amount of food or other resources that you need, and you would just get what you needed, maybe things would suffice also for others. But most people in the world don't behave like that. We're sometimes overly consuming. We're getting more and more and more, and it comes at the expense of others. But not only that, it also causes depletion in the environment that we live in, right? So the resources that we have in this world are limited and they are depleting. And there are warning signs and people saying that warning us again and again every so often about it. But it seems that by and large, people still muck around, they still kind of take that as a joke and ignore that. So that's what's happening around the world in general.
네, 단답에 계급 전부 인생에다 지금 로미 톱단단 잠블링 쿠유지 시에딩에서 탑된 로지라서 탑된 로 아니 계급 최슈도 속에 너무 축슈도 속에 잠블링 쿠유 떨긴 땅에 만시 공사 작이요. 저 드텐 천절로 소송이 쿠유 가주 떨긴 치거디. 디치디게 아니 당한주기 삼주시에 점으로도 당한 2years 때 기어 말았으라 안 미지기 모르셨다는 다 독자 쇼를 랍되나 직진이 다 독자래서 이네야 원내기 필이야 또 정해 투살에 킹한서 기 제도문도 왔으라.
So we have people that are active around the world saying that this is not right to treat the environment in this way, to consume in this way. But then it is often that big countries, powerful countries say that, well, we are big countries, we have the rights to do so. So it seems that it seems that currently in the global system, countries which are trying to create a system for reducing the damage that we inflict upon the environment, to reduce consumerism, are actually the wealthy countries which are calling on other countries to reduce their consumption. Whereas if we think of the bigger damage is actually inflicted by them. Not only that, we think of ammunition systems that are created by those countries, nuclear weaponry and so forth. Well, it actually creates just as much as damage in the world, but they're not speaking about reducing that. So Geshe feels that if those big problems, big issues are not going to be tackled on a global level. If you just tell kind of individuals stop driving your car or reduce your car driving, well, it's just going to be one drop in the ocean. The kind of the bigger Geshe feels that the bigger pollution is created by big countries. Okay. Anyway, we just have to leave it here for now. All right. So let's dedicate a virtue that we've created together. May the Supreme Jewel Bodhichitta that is not a reason arise and grow. And may that which is a reason not diminish but increase more and more. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, might quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you're the source of all happiness and good. All powerful Chinrezek Tenzin Gyatso, please remain till samsara ends. Sever of the snowland teachings and transmigratory beings who makes extremely clear the path of this unification of emptiness and compassion. To the lotus holder Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You uphold the Sibu's moral way, whose seventh manifold bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Majana's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplished magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels. Several of myself and others, your disciples, please live long.